Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm David Tunick, President of the IFPDA, and I welcome you to this terrific event, the 6th Jordan Schnitzer Family Foundation lecture today with Jim Dine. We're excited to hear further from Mr. Dine, one of the greatest artists of our time, as we further explore the collaborative process in printmaking. The question of what constitutes an original print late in the second decade of the 21st century is a lot different from the traditional definitions that have prevailed going back to the 15th century. Thank you to everybody who's put this together, Jordan Schnitzer, David Cleaton-Roberts, and our IFPDA staff. I'm now going to turn this over to my highly esteemed IFPDA member, David Cleaton-Roberts, who's partner and director of Christia Roberts Gallery in London, which represents Mr. Dine.
Morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming today to the Jordan Schnitzer Family Foundation lecture. First of all, I'd like to sincerely thank Jordan for his generous ongoing sponsorship of this Artist Talk program, as well as his wider support of the print community as a whole. It is through his support and vision that thousands of people are able to experience and engage with artists and their prints. It gives me huge pleasure to introduce this year's speakers, Jim Dine, Ruth Lingen, and Julia DeMario. Ruth Lingen began her career as the shop assistant for both Joe Wilfer and Walter Hamady during graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, specializing in letterpress, book arts, and relief printing. After teaching there for a year, she moved to New York in late 1985 and began freelance printing and papermaking, as well as honing her letterpress skills at the South Street Seaport Museum. Her first editioning project was a paper multiple for Louise Nevinson, under the direction of Joe Wilfer, who hired her a year later to assist him at the Spring Street Workshop, the new Soho print studio for Pace Editions. Julia DeMario joined Pace Editions as an etching printer in 1989, and after working at various print shops in New York for 6 years. At Pace, she assisted master printer Aldo Kromelink on projects with Red Grooms, Ed Ruscha, Jennifer Bartlett, Klaus Oldenburg. She also collaborated with numerous artists, including Jim Dine, Chuck Close, Mary Hyman, April Gornick, and Tara Donovan. Over the course of their careers at Pace, Julia and Ruth have developed a close working relationship with Jim Dine, traveling with him to Whitman College in 1998 to work on his book project entitled Carly, and to Israel in 2001 to participate in a 2-week print workshop. In 2007, Julia and Ruth established a print shop for Jim in his Walla Walla, Washington studio, and for the next 10 years they traveled to work with him there on many of his large-scale print projects. Since 2002, Julia has been instrumental in establishing and expanding the Jordan Schnitzer print residency at the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology on the Oregon coast. Each year, 3 artists with little or no printmaking experience are invited for an intensive 2-week residency with Julia. The resulting editions are divided between the artists and Sitka, with the proofs given to the program's benefactor, Jordan Schnitzer, and the Gordon Gilkey Print Center at the Portland Art Museum. For 2008-2018, Ruth was the founding member of Pace Paper, the Brooklyn papermaking facility for Pace Prints, where she worked on paper and print multiples. She now directs Line Press Limited, a workshop in Brooklyn devoted to artist books and small-scale print editions. Jim Dine really needs no introduction. Without question, one of the most important artists working today, he has consistently made prints throughout his career and considers printmaking to be as important a part of his practice as painting, drawing, and sculpture. Dine's approach to making prints has always been uncompromising. His technical mastery is matched by a constant desire to push the various mediums to their absolute limits and beyond. Over the course of his illustrious printmaking career, he has collaborated with the very best master printers, publishers, and print galleries from all over the world, many of whom are here today. Jim, I think, would be the first to acknowledge that part of the pleasure he derives from printmaking is the collaborative nature of the practice. Too often, printers are the unsung heroes of the print world, and so it feels particularly apposite to have two of his closest and most frequent collaborators here today to share the stage. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to give the floor to Jim, Julia, and Ruth.
Thank you, David.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm going to begin in about, louder? About 8 years ago, Gerhard Steidl, the German publisher, asked me to write a book about my life in printing. And I wrote a kind of memoir called Printmaker's Document. And I'm going to begin this event by reading something I wrote, which will explain a lot while we're here. It's called Printmaking, Things That Mean a Lot to Me, The Magic of Drawing Backwards. Number one, there's 12 of these things, reasons. Number one, having the time to execute a woodcut on a block, to draw with acid on copper plate, to see the grease from the litho crayon literally fall into the pores of the fossil-filled Bavarian limestone. Number two, the smell of the ink. Ink smells great. It smells great. Black bone mixed with linseed oil, and then to see the viscosity that's spread out with a knife to roll up with brayers or big litho rollers. Three, and this is really important to me, the friendships I've made with printers who print my work, the lessons I learn and have learned from them, not just technique to solve a visual or chemical problem, but many times I've learned how to be from them. Some have been very sensitive to my aggressive nature of drawing or cutting a block. Others have taught me to be restrained and quiet until we pull a proof. I have also printed with people who I've perceived didn't like me or what I made. Often, sadly, they have been failed artists, although I don't know if you are an artist, how you can fail. It's such a privilege and good luck. Usually they become vindictive and lose my drawings on the stone accidentally. Or they refuse to go along with my gypsy attitude to all printing media. When I was 17, I bought Paul Sachs' book, Modern Prints and Drawings. The discovery of prints on a world level opened my eyes. Reading it, I quite naturally felt the way things were, and that feeling for the various materials related like a friend to my love of hand tools. Their invention through use is a romance my soul is thrilled by. Number 5, the printing of giant woodblocks with a wooden spoon. I sometimes print the woodblocks now when they are very large, using lots of felt and blotters on my etching press. But often, as I did 60 years ago at art school, we use a spoon or numerous spoons. There are sometimes 3 or 4 of us working, them included, with spoons on the back of paper, usually mold-made Japanese paper. The tough, thin kozo fibers allow for a lot of rubbing, and the ink absorbs, as it did with Utamaro and Hokusai, 2 grandfathers for the printmaker. When there is more than one of us rubbing with the spoons, it's another collegial moment that I cherish. 6, I love the typesetters, paper makers, and bookbinders who I've worked with, who have enriched the cells of the print. I've given printmaking my wife's linen nightgowns and gotten back soft white etching paper. I worked in Cologne, Germany in the 60s with a man called Rudolf Rieser, who bound my books and portfolios by hand. He had a small suburban house where he lived with his exotic animal skins and various buckrams in his basement. It was like my grandfather's workshop in his basement, except Rudolph was binding the book of Diderot and Richard Hamilton. My grandpa wasn't. Aldo's Cromlink had an artist's book I made with him, typeset in Paris. It was a work that I collaborated with Robert Creeley on, and Aldo printed my etchings and made the book, or box, in the French way with loose prints and loose text pages. The type was a classic French font and looked fine and austere, just like Aldo. But I have had books since set by hand by my friend and printer Ruth Lingen. She has a vast collection of type and sets it and prints it by hand on her old Vandercook press, like my kind of human. I actually think it takes a person like Ruth to print type and set it for me. She just kisses the paper with the typeface. 7, the culture of making prints and printing. When I was 19, I worked for a while as a guy who made mats. I cut mats and framed for the curator of prints at the Cincinnati Art Museum. I was born in Cincinnati. He was called Gustav von Groschwitz, and he held a biennale of color lithography. I did the matting for this event. I was able to grasp the huge world of color lithography since the end of World War II. Of course, Picasso, Matisse, and Miro were included. Their prints were printed by great Frenchmen like Morlot, but also included were regional Americans who taught in art schools or kept their press in the barn out back. They printed for themselves, and they did it very well by hand. At that time, I'd never seen a real woodcut, I mean in the flesh. Maybe I'd seen a Rembrandt or a Whistler etching at a museum, but to touch 200 color lithographs with my hands by Europeans and Mexicans and Americans gave me the idea of what it was to be an artist who made prints. Now I'm going to talk about my chainsaw. I moved to Vermont with my young family in the summer of 1971. We lived on a little hardscrabble farm. We gardened and put vegetables up for the winter, and all my neighbors had chainsaws. And because of my penchant for tools, I was fascinated by this dangerous machine. In those days, I was not aware that there was an electric version. All the Vermonters powered theirs with gasoline. I bought one and I had no instructions, but through the years, I read about the technique and the hazards inherent in the act of cutting. I got better, I cut logs for the fire, and I pruned trees. And after I left Vermont in the mid-'80s, I forgot about it. I had never used it for cutting wood blocks or any other printing applications. But in 1972, I was at Pace Edition's Spring Street workshop, and I wanted to make a woodcut. For some reason, my impatience drove the gene to tell my brain that a chainsaw could really do the job. I went out and bought an electric one, and because I didn't want the exhaust fumes indoors, and I never looked back. On big plywood wood sheets, I was able to strip away huge areas of material and still get the traces of where I'd been. I cleared places and then went in with a Dremel and made the drawing more accurate. It also made a lot of noise, and some printers were scared, but the energy of it transformed the image. Later, I used it on copper plates to simulate the feathers of an owl. The Dremel, or rotary cutter, changed my way of working copper plates and wood blocks. It's a handy little rotary motor, like a dentist drill, that takes small cutting and grinding bits. If I'm in the right zone, I can concentrate for hours on the cutting. Many of my prints are completely cut by a Dremel. On a copper plate, it acts like an engraving tool. Or if you use it with a light touch, It can raise a burr for dry point. Artists of the 19th century like Mary Cassatt or Degas drew on copper plates easily because the plate was usually hammered so that the milled molecular structure of the plate was changed and softened, and it allowed the drawing to be fluid, and it allowed the needle or graver to move easily through the field of metal. When I first used the Dremel, it jumped all over the place as I was using roofer's copper, and there were lots of snags that came across. It has at times jumped onto my right forearm. I'm left-handed because of the way the copper was milled crudely. The Dremel can also be used with a flexible shaft that makes it handier for intricate drawing. The 10th reason I love printmaking is the 18-volt rotary grinder. I use it to erase my copper mistakes, which has ensured me through the years of instant pedimento in the etching because of the indelible tracks it leaves on the copper plate. Even though I use coarse to fine grade abrading wheels and then steel wool, you never really get the plate back so it can print a pure white. For me, that's always been a plus. As I've said elsewhere, I love showing my tracks, also leaving them. It's very much life-affirming. I'm here. Aldo Cromling showed me how to erase copper. He used a 3-sided, sharpened like a razor scraper, and then he burnished back to white with a steel burnisher. It was done with superhuman patience, and the result was like his printing, white, refined, accurate. I can always tell a Cromling print. I learned so much from him, and then I learned how to subvert his refinement and accuracy. That is when I became my own printer. 11. The fact that I've created over 1,200 prints doesn't matter one bit to me if I'm beginning a new one. The adventure of making and the hope of being able to unleash my arsenal of technique make for a unique creative moment. I rarely start a print with a specific image in mind. It's the voyage of printing that's gotten me here to start with a new image. And lastly, there is always some physical task a printer will perform while they are proofing my plates that catches my eye, like the way Julia uses her bare hand to finish and to bring to light the etching plate. This thrills me. We're going to put images on the screen. I'm going to talk about them, and the ladies are going to talk about them, what they've done. It's going to be that kind of informal, but we want to talk about process and how I made the prints. So where's the first one?
The first one vanished between the computers.
It vanished. That was the first one. This is the second one. In 1960, I was involved in the performance movement happenings, and one of the performances I made was called The Car Crash. And I had a friend who I went to college with called Andy Stasek, who was a printer and who was my classmate. And he then went and ran Pratt Graphic Arts Studio. And I made my first adult lithographs there. And that one on the left was a black and white lithograph printed by Emilio Maano Serrani. Wait a minute, go back a minute. The other one is a print I made after I did the sets for Midsummer Night's Dream for the Actors Workshop in San Francisco, and I printed this lithograph with Tanya Grossman at UALE. Okay, now this is Aldo, the great Cromling, and that's a little portrait I made of him posthumously in etching. that Julia printed. And this, Aldo and I, having a smoke outside a show we had in Brussels. Go ahead. And there's Aldo inspecting as an expert that he was, putting in a press. These are the two prints I made to begin with at Aldo's called Paris Smiles. They were the Eiffel Tower, and I made 4 versions of the Eiffel Tower in etching and in dry point. And 2 shells. And the heart on the right, on the left, is called, the heart called Paris Spring. My most elaborate print to that date. And I only could have made it with him at that point, where he kept the color so clean. The other is a series I did of a gate in front of his house called the Cromlin Gate.
Jim, how did you meet Aldo?
Sorry?
How did you meet Aldo?
I met Aldo because I was being published and printing with Paul Cornwall Jones at Petersburg Press. I was fortunate enough to, because for all his flaws as they were, the guy was the most creative editor I'd ever come across. And he gave me lots and lots of ideas. And he was printing with Richard Hamilton, and he told me, he said, Richard's been working with this French printer because Picasso just died, and it's freed this guy for the rest of us mortals. And so I went to Paris and met him, and we started to work, and we never stopped until he died. He was my dear friend. This is a print of tools I did with him, using spit bite, you know? Some of you don't know what spit bite is. It's, you put an aquatint on a plate, and instead of stopping out and then putting it in the acid bath, you take acid with, Julia will tell you.
Okay, in a spit bite, you take some full-strength ferric chloride, add a little bit of water and some spit so that the acid doesn't reticulate on the aqua-tinted plate and form little beads. It moves smoothly across the plate. And we used to joke at Pace that we always wanted Aldo spit in our spit bite when we used it.
Because of the
You
Galois
really,
cigarettes.
Yeah, the Galois cigarettes that he was always smoking over the cleaning table with the gasoline. But yeah.
These are of that series. They were, what was it, 5 or 4 tool prints?
4 tools.
4 tools. That they were prints I made with Aldo in Paris. I don't think I ever printed with him in America.
No.
I only wanted to be in Paris. I didn't want to be in America. And we then, many, many years later, Julia and I took the 4 plates and made 1 print out of it. I love recycling. I don't like to throw away anything. There's always something. I mean, it's a waste. There's always some idea. And what is this print called?
It's called the 5 Hammer Etudes.
Oh, 5 hammer etudes.
Yeah.
But it's really plates that Aldo and I did, and then we cut up and
And reworked,
reworked
round
them.
out.
I reworked
All
them.
the central tools are new. That
Yeah.
Hatchets, yeah.
So it's my method of continually reworking, eating them, and then regurgitating it up and making a new one, you know? Go ahead, Ruth.
This is the first set of prints that were done at Spring Street Workshop with Aldo's plates printed by, and the first time we used these oversized rubber stamps.
We used rubber stamps and that Ruth had made.
And it's a very scary thing to rubber stamp huge things on top of finished 4-hinged prints like this.
But-
So the plates were made in Paris with Aldo, shipped over, and we at the Spring Street Workshop editioned them, and Jim.
But it gave me this idea of really what I could do with rubber stamps and how I could use words. And because I am a poet, I've always wanted to get words into the work. And I had done it a little bit before, but this really got me. That you could just you could write out your name and then Ruth would have it made into a rubber stamp.
And they'd never seen anything like that at the rubber stamp place.
This man is called Kurt Zine. He was a Viennese etcher. And I got to him also through Richard Hamilton because we were all a little pissed off at Aldo because he was so neat and clean and precise and always giving us lessons. And Richard said that we could go to Vienna and stay in a great hotel and go out and work with this guy. The guy was a savage. And he would do anything. He was not plussed by me using a chainsaw. I brought in other electric tools. You know, he played the bongo drums all the time and he was drinking beer. And he had the terrible Nazi Kurt Wilhelm's picture in the toilet, epoxied there. He was that kind of guy, a man of taste.
He was famous
And
with us printers.
a lovely, lovely guy who I made so many prints with. And unhappily, he's with us, but not. He's on automatic pilot. These are all ones I did with Kurt.
Kurt,
And this, all the feathers in the owl are done with the chainsaw. That is, I took the chainsaw, I started it, and let it jump down the copper, watching my body as it went down the copper, because it was like, you know, a chainsaw can kick back, but this was really, Zine loved that. These are 9 of them, images I did. Zine gave me packing crates, and the worse the plywood, the better for me, because it's got all kind of stuff going on, and it's like a plus. And I used chainsaws and Dremels and gouges to make these, and we printed them on paper that's not archival. It was paper used for
Like
what?
craft paper.
Like craft paper for wrapping and that kind of thing. But it took the ink so beautifully. Who cared if it lasted? And it has lasted. It hasn't changed at all, which is obviously because of the toxic nature of it. These were done. These are 2 prints that I wanted to include them. Were done with 2 other people I've printed with through the years. One on the left is called the Garrity Necklace, which is a very elaborate etching and colored etching I did with a man in Georgetown, Massachusetts, called Bob Townsend, a terrific printer, and who transformed a offset lithopress into an etching press that's enormous. I loved printing with him, just it was too far away, and he was more interested, really and truly, he was more interested in umpiring girls' baseball. Really? You see, we're a funny bunch. The other one was done by the Danish printer Niels Borch Jensen. I was at Louisiana one summer in residency at the Louisiana Museum in Humlebæk, Denmark. And I wanted to etch, and I found this guy, and he was a big shot etcher in Copenhagen. And so I made this very big print. And I loved printing with him because it was so messy and dirty. And the phone book was there, and it was torn up, and it had black ink everywhere. And my then wife said to me, we can't stay here. This guy is a slob. I mean, I said, do you ever look at me? I mean, this is the way my studio looks. I was really at home with Niels Borch. And I printed with him a couple of times, but never got back to it. But he was a wonderful printer. This one was done with my dear friend Don Saff, one of the most creative people I've ever worked with, collaborated with. How big is it? It's real,
massive. It's like
it's real
60
big.
by-
Each panel is about
80 inches high or something.
80 inches
I think
high
something like that.
by a foot and a half. And he introduced me on this to so many different techniques. The one on the technique, the nude on the right, I carved by hand on a tabletop I had. But much of the other stuff is etching, and also he had a technique that he got from a guy who did the lettering on Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. It was a sandblasting technique but a photographic one, so that I could draw on a Mylar sheet in black ink, and as long as there was no halftone, they were able to put it onto wood and sandblast it, just like this guy had done. The guy didn't know that Saf was going to use it for this. I mean, he got it out of him that way, and it was so accurate. The India ink marks, I was stunned by it. The background is hand coloring and
It's like rainbow roll?
no, not spit bite. No, I used a mop. They put an aquatint on, and I used a mop with nitric outside. It was in Florida, so the smoke was, from
So
the
straight on the plate with no aquatint.
no
Yeah.
no aquatint, no, just right onto the plate
open bite.
with the mop and nitric acid. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, there they are.
Flashback to
The
Julie
kid-
and I.
when they were kids,
Julie
yesteryear.
and I, the child printers. We were in our 20s here when we got into this business. There we are with the famous Joe Wilfer, who, as David mentioned, was my mentor in grad school, and he had come out to Wisconsin.
There was the word no did not exist
No.
for Joe Wilfer.
No.
He
And-
could do anything. He was the youngest Eagle Scout in Wisconsin.
Yes, not as, and he could keep up with Jim and the power tools and taking the safeties off these horrifying devices. But I have to say, the thing that I most credit Joe with, besides his incredible versatility, creativity, was he was a man of incredible generous spirit, and he was always the unifier of the group. He brought everybody together. You worked as a team, and for me personally, he was the person who said, Ruth, I would say, well, I need to do this. He said, no, Ruth, it's not I, it's we. We need to do this. That way, when I fail, we all fail. And when I succeed, we all succeed. But, and it was so fantastic. I worked with him for 8 years. Learned so much from him. I have very few pictures of him working because it was mostly, work was so fun for him. He's either dressed up as Willie Nelson or he's pouring a Tom and Jerry, and very convivial. And it was like an ongoing social thing when Joe was around. I remember we had a type guy who would come in and deliver type, and when Jim was working, he would just come in and drop things off. So it was of course, Jim we knew very well when he came in through the Aldo connection to work at Spring Street Workshop. This was 1991. We did a group of 10 very large woodcuts that were our first project at Spring Street with Joe as the director of that project. And this one, the summer, was an addition of 33 plus 14 proofs, each section 3 by 4 feet, 5 colors, 5 wood blocks. And we did all this under Jim's direction, which basically consisted of him running into the studio in the morning, and we were all completely terrified that we weren't going to, well, Joe wasn't, but all of us young printers were very terrified and intimidated by Jim. And so we'd rush. We ran that whole summer like crazy to get these prints done.
Would say that was the first. That was the first chainsaw print.
The first, yes, because Jim had all the chainsaws set up and had 3 of them at that time that we would take out to get sharpened. And this print, entitled Love and Grief, was done on very heavy butcher blocks that were found down in Chinatown and dragged up supremely heavy. And he also introduced his safetyless Japanese hedge trimmer at this point. Now we're part of this group, Forest Up North, which was printed by Joe, Julie, and myself, 12 runs in 15 colors from 7 wood blocks, edition of 17. That size is 78 inches by 42. So this is when we really got into the kind of scale that we've now come to be familiar with Jim. And on the right is a print called To the Lake, or Summer. I lost my notes.
Lakeside?
Well, Lakeside, yes. So that's
But
another.
you know that the tree is from that print that we showed before.
Yes.
From Don Saff.
From Don Saff, yes.
I cut I cut the wood block.
Yes.
So as I say, I don't throw away anything.
Yes, and these were the very last prints that we did on our hydraulic press at Spring Street before we moved up to 18th Street, before Pace moved up to 18th. 2 other prints from that early series. This was interesting, the heart with the hand-colored eye, and the eye was cut into a knot into the wood. And again, this print is cut entirely with chainsaw. And as is the skull on the right, and this was done on papermaking felt because we also had a paper mill down there. And I remember having to hide the felts because Jim would come in and covet them, and so we let him have 10, and then I started hiding them so he couldn't.
Besides the printing on them, they're great to draw on.
Yes, so hide the felts. Okay.
I would just like to say one thing about Joe Wilfer. When I came to Pace as part of the team, the thing that really struck me was, well, many things, but 2 things, how he said we can never say no to an artist. You may, in the back of your mind, think, oh, that's not going to work, that's going to be a big failure, but it may not, and it might lead to something even more exciting, so never say no. And that's not something I'd heard in my other experience in learning to become a printer, and I think that's why we ended up working so successfully with Jim, because it doesn't work to say no, really.
No, but you never said no.
Right, because I learned that early from Joe. And he also said, Julia, there's no such thing as an art emergency, because we would get really stressed about something not working or somebody coming in and we weren't quite ready. And he'd say, let's sit down and play some Boggle, get our minds off it, and then move on.
No more tears.
And
he
I
would
also
say.
gained my appreciation for Bob Dylan, because
Yes.
Bob Dylan was playing at all times in the studio. So let me just introduce,
back and talk
yes,
about
Bill Hall. So
Oh, sorry.
I had worked with Bill Hall at the printmaking workshop when it was on 17th Street. He had been a master printer there and moved on to Pace and brought me along with him. And so we worked together for many years, all the way through our move to 18th Street and Pace Prints. And this is one of the first real etchings we made with Jim. We'd started with making some cardboard intaglio, which we will get to. But this is called Venus in Powdered Stone. And also, Jim did all the hand painting on the paper before we printed the etching paper, the etching plate. And that became part of our way of
Repertoire.
working.
It was one of our ways of working.
Right.
I painted on almost everything.
You
yeah.
painted on everything, either before or after the plates were
It
printed.
came out of my impatience. I
Right.
could not wait for them to put on an aquatint and get to. I said, let's get in there. I mean, I'm still. Well, I can still raise my arm. You know, why don't we do it?
Right, but we were all much younger then, too. So this was a portfolio of 55 self-portraits, and this is also one of the first projects that Bill and I worked on together for Jim, and it went on for quite a few months. Jim came in and made 10 self-portraits using every etching technique we had available, and then Bill and I spent weeks proofing them in all different combinations of ink, plates on top of each other. They were all more or less black and white.
And explain that the 10 became
55.
55.
55 versions that are all...
Because we made sandwiches.
Right.
I mean, they just kept
We
on
printed them
going.
in register, and then
Then
Jim...
out of register, and
Right.
we kept proofing them in.
Yeah.
So they're all come from 10,
Right.
but they're all different.
Different. And the one on the right with the black, the plate started to smoke because you were using a grinder, and you basically annealed the copper and broke right through it. You can see that little white dot in the eye. That's where actually the grinder went all the way through the copper plate.
Aldo was so appalled when
Yes, very appalled.
by my use of power tools. He
On
said
etching plates.
he said that Jim turned the copper purple.
Yes,
You know,
yes,
he felt as though that
exactly.
was a
Exactly.
terrible thing I had done.
But the thing about this project and a turning point for me in working with Jim, I thought, wow, he really trusts us to make some decisions here, how to put the plates together in combination, what colors. He's giving us some leeway and latitude that other artists I'd worked with would never have felt confident enough to give the printers.
Yes.
And then it invested us as well. Okay, we're part of this team.
That was the point.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the point of printing with people who are like just automatons? I wanted to print with humans who give me something back and I give something too, and we collaborate on something, and that's the fun of it. I mean, it was always energizing.
Yes, always fun. And this is another example. This is when we moved up from Spring Street to 18th Street to a larger.
This is hand colored.
This is also hand-colored, hand-watercolored. It's called the Mandrake. So it's just another example of pure etching with hand coloring. And I would say the bulk of the work we did with Jim at 18th Street was cardboard intaglio or collagraph.
Can I speak?
Yes, I want you to.
Cardboard intaglio, Kurt Zine sort of invented. One day, Zine and I were in a beer garden where they drink the new wine in Grinzing above Vienna. And we were sitting there, and we were getting drunk, and we were talking, all we were talking about was etching. We said, etching. And I said, can't we make an etching like a charcoal drawing? And he said, why not? So 6 months later, I came back, and he showed me he'd gotten some kind of crappy cardboard. What was it? It was like
called Upsom board.
Upsom board. And he showed me that if I use my power tools, the chainsaw, the Dremel, the grinder, and cut in like copper, but cut in, and then coat it with clear acrylic gloss medium, many coats, the back, the edges, you can wipe it like an etching plate. And you can wipe it longer than an etching plate, can't you? I mean, it never wears out. And you get something like a charcoal drawing. Well, it isn't. But it's a fuzzy black line that's warm. And for me, it's a sensual line.
And this gets back to the directness. He didn't really need us in this process. We would provide the gloss, and you can also use matte medium, and it will retain some more of the tone on the cardboard.
You get gray, I'm sorry.
You get gray or gloss, so you can play with what areas you put the gloss on versus the matte. These two prints are called Very Picante and Pale Self. We started with Very Picante, and here we actually did a jigsaw with cardboard. It's very easy to cut, so we could work relatively quickly, and we rolled on colors, positioned it within the frame of the jigsaw, printed it once, and then printed two other robe cardboards on top of it. But it looked so beautiful after the first relief pull that we decided to pull ghosts of every print as we additioned it. It's a ghost print, right?
Without re-inking.
Without re-inking. And so we had this addition of really beautiful pale jigsaws, and Jim put one of the ones that I think looks the most like charcoal on top to make a pair.
Say how it was done.
Okay, well this was with this is called Proconsul.
It's called the Proconsul.
Yeah, and it's two cardboard plates, and you really piled on the medium, and as it dried, it cracked in really beautiful ways. And where those cracks formed, more ink held in the cardboard.
You can't see it so much from there, but in the real print,
covered in cracks
it's
like a
very,
crack.
very physical.
Yeah, it's very physical, and the chainsaw, you use the chainsaw on the cardboard a lot here, so it's very rich and deep black, and it's very immediate. And you can also intaglio wipe very bright colors because like a steel-faced copper plate, it doesn't oxidize.
Let's keep going.
Okay. And this very beautiful print, Head from Dark River, is really mixed media. We had woodcut, etching, cardboard printed, both relief and etching on this. This is quite a large-scale print, and really one of the great ones from that
Also,
period of us working together there.
Jigsaw cardboard.
And jigsaw cardboard, as well.
Manhattan flowers. Well,
They were just,
Just some beautiful.
well, we have them in
hand-colored
because they're a collaboration with a silkscreen shop. So some of the photographic image, or some of the images done with silkscreen, and then we did the etching and hand coloring.
a lot of watercolor.
A lot of watercolor.
Yeah.
And, you know, I taught in Berlin in the 90s, and I wanted to photograph, and a guy showed me a technique, 19th century technique, called heliogravure. And so I took some photographs with it, and it's printed by Julia, it's transferred to a copper plate. The negative is transferred to the copper plate, and Julia wipes it like an aquatint. So
And they're very large.
they're large, and the quality is like an aquatint. So I started to use then the other ones. But those are etchings on that copper plate where there was a photo of tools, and then I etched it again. And the same with the owl. It's over a heliogravure. Those also.
So really showing this interesting combo of different techniques
Yeah.
paired together.
And
that we-
that I will use anything to get an image.
Yes. And just a little bit more about the chainsaw. The chainsaws that Jim had, where he had 3 small chainsaws. When we moved from Spring Street Workshop to 18th Street, do you remember this, Jim? They were the only items that were stolen en route. Were your 3 small chainsaws. So, but here he is working with the chainsaw and that Dremel that he was talking about, making a very large print called the Big Wall of Hearts, 2002. There you see it's in progress. It has an incredible number of blocks and runs and states, and it has 5 printed states, and in between each state, we have these hand coloring charts. Here's 3 of them, and if you can read closely in the middle section, it will say oil-based ink used with potato, or take your finger and rub charcoal right here. So we'd print a layer, then we'd nag him to come in and do the hand coloring, then we'd print again. There he is working on one of the stages with the map next to him of what he's to do. And here's that final print, which is very large, and also just extremely painterly looking. It's like a gorgeous, luminous painting. And it was really a highlight for me of combination of techniques as well. One of my more interesting things that I ever helped Jim with was a print called The White Foot that was done around that time. You see, I'm hovering behind him while he's got a palette with white ink, and he's inking up his own foot and hopping from print to print while I'm trying to grab the ink behind. And this is Yasu Shibata, who's a traditional ukiyo-e printer, looking on sort of, dramatically on the background. But, and then to speak a little about some of our junkets on the road again, in 1998, we traveled together out to Walla Walla, Whitman College, to do a book art symposium that was organized by Kathy Keene, who you'll see photos of shortly, and Keiko Hara. We talked there about a project that we spent a week getting together a dummy for called Kali, which Jim mentioned earlier. Here was his workstation that he set up in the art building. So the students were kind of in and out that were doing this book arts conference. Very hands-on. And that was the first of our...
And the photo shows how I make my poems. I write them on the wall that large, usually.
Yes.
So we made the book on the wall.
Yeah, and I'm going to speak just a little bit about those later, but there's the title page from Kali. And here we are at the kibbutz in Israel. We went for a 2-week workshop with 12 contemporary artists sponsored by Dov Gottesman at that time. And there's Jim working away in the studio. He brought a crate of things, including some taxidermied animals. And there's the crowd of people, sort of. It was interesting because it was a collaboration where all these printers came. Everybody did shifts of printing. And it was real mayhem, but there was a conviviality that was really fun. And there you see Dove there. And, sort of chaotic. There you see us printing away as fast as we can. And a lot of the work was done outdoors because the print shop was too small to contain, 13 working artists and 8 working printers. So everything would spill out outside, including print drying. And one of the beautiful prints done there was, again, a combination, cardboard, photogravure, and heliogravure, and hand painting, called Mask and Heart. And this beautiful raven, which has a combination of 2 woodcuts and a soft ground etching. And now we're going to take you back to Walla Walla, where in 2007, as David said, Julie and I helped Jim set up a print shop at his painting studio there. Here's a cast of characters here. In 2007, it was us, and then in the summer to the left, Aurélie Pages came from Paris, and this Daniel Clark also joined in 2008, and here on the right is Bill Agatudu and Nina Dine also joined in 2009, as well as Kathy Keene, who's coming up again. And I wanted to put this in and show you how we deal with the drying system of these large prints. We have a 4x8 foot piece of plywood that we slog around with 4x8 felts, blotters, and they get strapped from underneath the table because we need the tabletop. So we do this 2 or 3 times a day, and the cursing and that goes on. But and again, another woodcut for scale. July on the Palouse, the first large size. There's the scale of that. You can see it on the wall. And we did print, that was an edition, I believe, of 20 or so, all hand rubbed, and then a lot of additional proofs. And again, we do the combo prints. Here's Pinocchio's Black Tie, one of my personal favorites from Walla Walla. And this is woodcut, printed dry, and then hand painted. And then the soft ground and etching plate, or was it soft ground? That goes over the top. And this print was so well done that we had, despite sometimes the stretch that you get on these 62-inch sheets of paper of being sometimes 3/4 of an inch, this particular edition was perfectly registered for every single copy. And keep going, sorry. Okay, Jim, you want to take over? And just to walk you through a complicated project, how we do this quickly, I had a day and a half to do color separation. There's a drawing on the wall. It will become a 35 color print, and that will incorporate lithography. Here you see Jim painting the first plates that will go down. There you see Bill Agatudu and Nina printing the first state, orange, second state, pink. And here we're getting ready to do all the selective inks with the different wood blocks that are all inked very quickly. Here you see the 4 different states as the print is progressing, woodcut, rubber stamp, et cetera, et cetera. And there they are coming off the press with the wood block on the left. On the right, it is the soft ground coming up, which ties the whole thing together. And that print as well, some of the elements were used to make this. Do you want to speak about that, Julie?
Okay, and I will say the thing about working in Walla Walla, we were a real team. We came together. Well, Ruth and I usually went in the spring for 1 month to start projects, and in the summer, the whole team came from all over the country. We sort of called it the Olympic dream team of printers, and we all worked on everything. So I'm trained as an etching printer, but I've been able to really learn a lot about printing woodcuts because we all had to help with the woodcut.
But
we
also I want to talk quickly about my life, and was rather short at Tamarin Institute, but I was fortunate enough to print with a great lithographer there, Bill Agatudu, and he would come in the summertime. I would go to Tamarin in the winter, but he would go in the summertime, and once we got a litho press, and it was really a pleasure.
And he'd help with all the other projects, too.
Say
I wanted to just say this was my scariest days of printing, which was setting up these movable pieces of wood on the press and printing them like that. They crunched, they fell over, they turned.
It's a poem.
It's-
It's a poem that we printed in 2 colors, but
Yes.
only once or twice.
Yes, and there you see again different states of that, entitled A Garden.
And there was never just one project going on. There'd be massive etching projects as well as litho and woodcut projects going on, and it's a fairly large space, but small for the size and scale. This print is called Landscape of Things, and it had 16 states. Jim had this print in his part of the studio, working it and reworking it 16 times before he was happy with how it looked. And then this is me wiping and Ruth helping edition it.
This is the great Kathy
Yes.
Keene. She's not here, she's in Portland, but
We
One
worked
of-
with her
she's
at
one
Pace
of us.
Editions. Yeah.
Yes, and this is the typical paper size
Size.
that we start with.
And we had to do everything outside, all the etching and cleaning of plates. This was our patio in Walla Walla, so this is the bath of ferrochloride.
the acid bath.
Yes. And this is Jim working, and I would drill holes in the big plates because it was the only way he could do the soft grounds. I'd drill holes, nail the plates to the wall, and then hang the Japanese paper over the soft grounded plate so that Jim could draw with his charcoal and pencils. And then this is the print on the other side. This is called a Wall of Tools, Objects of Desire.
2010, I was printing lithographs in Berlin with two young Tamarind printers. And I looked over in the room, and there was 100 Bavarian limestones, litho stones, something you don't see anymore because nobody wants them, they're too heavy. And that's how lithography began, by the way, if you don't know it. And they all had on them images which would be called now social realism. They came from an art school in the communist part of Berlin. And after the wall fell, it went on, and they went on to numeric techniques, and nobody wanted to use litho stones. So I said, where'd you get them? And they said, well, we're given them, 100 of them. And you know, you can buy them in America, very expensive. They got 100. Each one had over 30 years of social realist drawing on them. And I had this idea called the history of communism. I took 45, I had them proof them and bring them back to life. There were pictures of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Marx, Lenin, Workers' Paradise, et cetera, et cetera. And then after they printed them, they editioned them out. They sent them to Julia in Walla Walla, and we put etchings on top over 2 years, and we called it the history of communism.
And all of them are original, or not original, but you started a new plate for each one.
Yes.
Sometimes they're 2 and 3 plates, taking plates from Aldo's inventory. All of Aldo's plates came. Jim would rework a plate from Aldo, rework a plate from Pace. Sometimes they'd be put on the images as well, but every single one has a plate you made for it expressly. And this is Jim signing the colophon.
And here's a few more photos of Bill Lacatuda.
Yeah.
I was making a drawing, and Bill was printing on the stone. I have some big stones out there.
That's how you dry the big stones.
A little primitive.
Again,
And
more.
hand painting on
Hand
color.
painting.
And Jim does really crazy mono printing too when we're out there. So here we've set up with one shot, all kinds of oil-based paint, ink, and it's really fun to kind of see those things dry in the sun outside. Painting on the plexi. Here you see the actual plexi covered with ink. There it is getting peeled off, gushing a little bit. And there you see the wood block being used as the matrix for the mono printing while being filmed. We're often being filmed while we're printing, so. And the scale, again, is quite large, and sometimes they have to be put outside to dry in the sun. Very hot out there. And some of the other techniques employed by Jim in hand coloring, the grinder directly on the prints, as well as this was an addition on the right that was done with spray paint as the color behind. Transferring, working on litho plates, and again, the one-shot monoprints. And
then at one point, I had an idea to make an installation called the House of Words, where I would print my poems out long and put them all make an environment. And this was the beginning of that, where we made large prints, carving them with linoleum. So we made a font
right.
in linoleum.
And just a few more monoprints. This is the wood blocks that were used to make the ghost prints that went behind these. These are some of my favorite monoprints that have all manner of paint, splashes and washes, charcoal. I just think they're really luminous with the ghost behind and all the handwork.
The grinder.
The rotary grinder. This is what you get.
So what you see on the copper plate before
Yeah.
it's printed.
What else?
Grinder,
And
grinding,
more
The
grinding.
big silk screen from London.
And
printing.
And the one on the Venus on the right is a silkscreen taken from a photograph in my London studio in the early 80s of a sculpture I had made in bronze sitting in the studio. I was going to patina it, so we photographed it. Then I had an English printer take the photograph and make silkscreen on beautiful paper. And for 40 years, I've used this maybe 50 sheets until they've all gone away of this image, and I've printed over it and painted over it, drawn over it. It's just an example of me not letting anything go to waste.
This was an
It's
edition of 12.
All grist for my mill.
Couple other additions: combination woodcut litho, combination digital hand painting, and a cutout etched plate. Here again, you see a little more of we're transferring from lino blocks inked up onto a litho plate, so then we can print those larger prints you saw earlier. Nina's demonstrating that.
Oh.
And here's a failure. It's a failure. We spent 2 summers trying to make this print, and finally threw it away. But so there are certain things I cannot solve.
Printing outside. Here we've soaked the paper with mineral spirits before printing.
We got to move along. I
Okay,
hate
yep.
boring people.
Okay. Here we go. We're at the last few prints. We're going to break it up with a movie now, if I can get
A
this
little bit
together.
of a movie to show you how we used
Is it going?
History of Communism fragments and a big woodcut, and we glued them down.
The etchings were printed on shiramini in little sections of the plate, of all the plates, and then cut out and
And the
collaged.
people and the printers actually moved that fast, so that it was quite fun to watch. Voila.
Oh
so
no,
sort of,
oh
yeah.
no.
And it ended up like this. It was a big woodcut head or whatever it was, and the etchings underneath. And
And that's the last formal one from Walla Walla. There's Kathy in that one.
Yeah.
And we move on very brief of artist books. I'm now working on my 6th artist book with Jim. Here's a couple images of Kali, which was handset type with those very beautiful small etched plates. 3 shots of that.
and
Pictures, which was done with
Robert Creeley and I collaborated on this with Bill Lagatuda. And then
and then Donkey in the Sea.
Donkey in the Sea, which was poems I did about Pinocchio with
printed.
you, with Ruth.
Yep. And Michael Woolworth, small litho stones printed full.
Yeah.
Here's
And
Jewish Faith.
here's a long poem called Jewish Fate that Ruth and Nina Dine did.
Dummy and the
We're going
actual
as
print.
fast as we can, folks.
We're almost done.
We're almost done.
Okay, these are the final prints
This
Jim's
is
working
one
on
of
now.
my last prints that I've done recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, with my 2 friends and expert printers in Austria, Gabby Peckman and Christoph Chauvin, who are here today. It's woodcut many times over. We printed these many times. This is where I'm at now, a much more complicated printer and a much more complicated person. This is where it's going. And
this-
this one you can see at David's booth, at Christia Roberts' booth, the big woodcut that one of the people I work with, Olymp Bracano Weiler, and I cut by hand the woodcut, and then we painted. So each one is a different color, each print, and it's 5 panels. And that's it, isn't
That's it.
And
That's
before we end, I just want to read one more thing from the printmaker's document that I wrote about how I feel about printing. I mean, what you already know. And it's got me.
Pick up the mic, please.
And it's got me by the back of the neck printing. And I mean, I will never stop printing. But I wrote this, I said, you got to care about prints. You got to care about woodcuts, lithographs, etchings. You can't care about whether they sell or whether anyone feels the way you do about your images. I love printmaking so much, I try not to care about anything beyond my ego. I keep going because, like the woman who swallowed the knives and nails, I can't stop. I've put my life into this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The last word to our great patron, Jordan Schnitzer, whose collection might be a little bit larger than yours. He has between 13 and 14,000 contemporary prints, and Jordan is really responsible, and David up there for today's event. Jordan Schnitzer.
In addition, I thought you should know, in addition to how spectacular an artist Jim is, when my mother closed her gallery in Portland, Oregon in the mid-'80s, after 25 years, I went down, and what started this big print collection is I went to the Ogden Gallery and I bought 3 prints, a small Frank Stella, a small Hockney, and Garrity necklace. And I haven't stopped buying Jim Dine's prints since. But in terms of his spirit of generosity, in Eastern Oregon, there's a Confederated Tribe Umatilla Reservation, one of those terrible things we did in this country by smushing all these fabulous Native Americans into a couple 100,000 acres. They started 45 years ago an entity called Crow Shadow, so the Native American kids could become artists. Who shows up 10, 12 years ago to an exhibition we had there? Jim Dine, to show his support for those Native American kids. Never forget that. Then, a few years ago, we funded a museum at Washington State University, 30,000 students, the land-grant school in Eastern Washington. And there's a fabulous Jim Dine double heart there on campus. And he calls up and said he'd like to donate some prints. He's now donated 375 prints to that museum. So the 250 kids that are going to that museum, the Olson Kundig designed beautiful Crimson Cube Museum, are benefiting from your generosity. So in addition to what you've done for all of us by making the art that we get to experience and have such joy, the fact you give back so much just puts you on such a huge pedal as a human being of caring about others beyond just making incredible art. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's all done. Thank you. Hello. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Ruth, Juliet, and Jim for a fantastic and engaging talk. Thank you.